Hello and greetings, lovely listeners, to the We Need to Talk About Whiteness podcast. As ever, I'm your host, Myriam Francois, and for those joining us for the very first time, welcome. This is a space where we explore the meaning of whiteness as the term is used in conversations around race and racism and as it pertains to different areas of our lives. Why whiteness? Well, it seems to me that as our societies here in Europe and similarly in North America become increasingly aware of conversations around race and racism, that the focus on whiteness provides some introspective focus and hopefully some direction in terms of how we can positively seek to affect change. So welcome to all you newbies. In this episode, I'm honoured to welcome writer, sex educator and author of Kunyaza, The Secret to Female Pleasure, Habeeb Akande. Habeeb was recently featured in the BBC documentary The Orgasm Gap, which explored the cultural differences of teaching sexual pleasure in the UK and Rwanda, East Central Africa. A well-travelled public speaker, Habeeb has given workshops on sex intimacy and sexology at leading academic institutions in France, Nigeria, Brazil, the UK, and the United States. Habeeb has also authored books on race and religious history. First off, Habeeb, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Cool. So tell me, first off, what is a sex educator and how exactly did you get into this?
It's a very good question. So a sex educator is basically someone who teaches sex, whether it's in the form of writing books, providing workshops, writing short articles to help people not only the actual act of sex, but also areas to do with sex, like, for example, the concept of desire, helping individuals and couples awaken and sustain desire, especially in a long-term relationship. And also sex educator is someone who might provide presentations to children about sexual health and STIs and things like that. So the sex educator title is quite broad because, again, it can manifest itself in very different spheres depending on what type of work someone does. But for me, in particular, my area of work as a sex educator is mainly in the realm of conducting research on female sexuality and the orgasm gap. My main area of interest is female sexuality in the early Islamic world and female sexuality in Africa. And I also undertake, which you mentioned earlier, some workshops on intimacy and sexuality for couples and individuals.
And so you've been doing this for presumably many years now. Out of interest, how would you describe attitudes to sex and sexuality in the UK?
I think there is still a reluctance to speak openly and honestly about sex. I think there is, I think attitudes are changing somewhat amongst millennials, but I think people are still uncomfortable about having open and honest conversation, like I said, about sex, especially in mixed gendered sessions. So normally when I undertake workshops, is either in just amongst men only or amongst women, or if I'm having mixed gendered workshops, normally the women are more interested about the topic, whereas a lot of men, maybe because of perceptions about sex being something that we're just naturally good at, we don't really want to a lot of men I find don't really want to open up and show their vulnerability and share their insecurities, especially in environments where women are there as well. So men, I think, more would like to listen, whereas I think women are more likely to, from my experience, likely to not only listen and learn, but actively engage in discussions in terms of not only for themselves, but also they're interested in the topic of sexuality in other parts of the world and about different sexual practices, and also obviously how can they improve their own not only sex life, but also how they can embrace their sensuality, because I think that's very important that a lot of women, particularly in the West, I don't think they feel comfortable to own their sensuality.
And where do you feel like that particular reserved sort of attitude to sensuality and sexuality comes from?
I think it comes from in the UK, it comes from our understanding about sex and sexuality being one for procreation, and that stems from the Victorian Christian understanding about sexuality and morality. And I think that still is quite dominant in many people's understandings about sex. I think even despite the sexual revolution which took place, which started in the 1960s, I think there's still a lot of people, especially young people, who are uncomfortable to have open, honest conversations about sex. It's seen as something that you do when you're drunk, But in terms of actually speaking about it and speaking about your insecurities and your vulnerabilities, not many people in the UK are really, they're more interested in speaking about love and romance, but sex itself, especially sexual pleasure and different types of sexual experiences, even like female ejaculation, multiple orgasm and things like that. I don't think many people are comfortable to have that conversation unless they're watching or learning about it in the comfort of their own home or watching things like porn, which for me is a lot of it is sex miseducation as opposed to sex education. But for many people, and especially young people, pornography is like the main source for them to learn or unlearn about sex.
Well, I was actually going to ask you about that. So obviously, when we talk about sex in the UK, we're talking about inherited Victorian attitudes, which you mentioned, a lot of the presumably lie back and think of England or whatever the expression is. And then obviously porn comes into it as one of the main sources for young people learning, or as you say, unlearning about sex. Where else do people learn about sex? Where are our attitudes, where's our understanding of what constitutes good or desirable sex coming from in the UK or in Europe maybe?
Social media now for many millennials, I think social media has become a great avenue for people to learn about sex, about sexual pleasure, about sensuality, and even amongst friends. For some people, from my experience, many people learn about sex and sexual pleasure from their peer group or porn, or even from Hollywood movies, to be honest. But from their families, not many people. When I ask the question that where did you learn about sex, or what was about sexual pleasure, or how to pleasure your partner, things like that, most people would either say porn or their friends or something that they've seen on a movie. So I definitely think mainstream media does. They're the biggest source after porn in terms of influencing and shaping our attitudes about sex and what is. And I think there's a lot of pressure, unfortunately. So there's a lot of pressure, particularly amongst young people, to engage in sex when they might not be ready, especially emotionally, because we live in a very performative, goal-orientated culture where people want to be seen to be having as much sex as their peers. So if someone has sex by the age of 16, 17, it's kind of seen as like a goal, particularly amongst young men, to lose their virginity by a certain period, and even amongst a number of women nowadays, especially with the there's a lot of talk about women being sexually liberated, but then I always ask the question, what do you mean by being sexually liberated? Is that because that can come in many forms? Does that mean you have multiple sexual partners? Does that mean that you are monogamous? Does that mean that you're celibate, but you are comfortable with your sexuality? But for many people, when they think about being sexually liberated, it means to be promiscuous and have multiple sexual partners. And there are a number of women who maybe come from conservative backgrounds, or they're just maybe not comfortable in sharing a body with multiple people. They're under pressure that if they are not somewhat promiscuous or engaging with a number of sexual partners, they're seen as being prudish. So whilst we've escaped the Victorian attitude about sex and sexuality, where we want to be more quote unquote liberated, there's now more pressure on people who don't necessarily want to have multiple sexual partners to have multiple sexual partners before they settle down. It's seen as like you need to experience different people before you can have a committed relationship. And I think that's something that a lot of people, both men and women, are suffering from.
Well, that's definitely what you get from, TV series, movies, kind of popular culture, isn't it? Seems to be the sort of omnipresent perception of what constitutes the normal path for before you settle down eventually and are relegated to a sexless marriage, right? Which is where it all ends up. So it's tongue in cheek. I'm just wondering, obviously the podcast is focused on whiteness, and I'm interested to hear from you how you feel that whiteness manifests in this particular field and what you understand by the term whiteness.
That's a big question. I think it depends on the context. So if you'd ask me when I think of whiteness, what do I think of? I just think it refers to people of European descent who are fairing complexion. If I'm speaking or I'm thinking about whiteness in the context of racial studies, it refers to the structure of like white supremacy or white people being the dominant culture. So again, it manifests itself differently depending on the context. In the field of sex education and sexuality,
Yes.
whiteness is definitely, I was going to say, yeah, it is a problem. And the reason why I say it's a problem, because whiteness is a worldview. It's a perception generally based on Eurocentric, and by Eurocentric, I'm referring to people who are also in the Americas or Australia of European ancestry, their worldview or their understanding about what is sex and sexuality. And when we look at sex education, particularly in the UK, it does tend to center white narratives, and it does exclude brown and black people's sexual experiences. And this is shown in not only sexual studies, where in most cases, most sex educators, sex therapists, and even the participants of majority of the major sexual studies are based on experiences of white people. And there is a cultural bias, which I think maybe there's a blind spot, which unfortunately many, even sex therapists, I don't think they are, they're not aware that they racialize others, but they deracialize themselves. As in, when we look at the experiences of people of African descent or people of Asian descent, and their studies conducted on people from that parts of the world, it's seen as black sexuality or Asian sexuality. But whereas when we're looking at the experiences and studying the practices of people in America who happen to be of European descent, that's just seen as sexuality. So it's something that, again, whiteness is framed as being normative, objective, and scientific in Western sex education, whereas other, like blackness or brownness, if you want to call it that, that's otherized, and that's seen as black sexuality, like I said, or another unique type of sexual practice or sexual behavior that we as white people or white sex educators need to understand and even maybe civilize those people. So I definitely think, whilst again, for me personally, even when we look at sexology, which is kind of understood to be the study of human sexuality, and it's considered to be objective, I don't think it can ever be completely objective. The same way I don't think a sex educator can be completely objective, because even when you are reviewing and observing sexual practices, when you're collecting data, you're doing it based on your own cultural understandings and morality, which a lot of white sex educators fail to realize. Whereas when they're reviewing and looking at the works of black sex educators or sexologists from other parts of the world, they will speak about their own culture. Maybe they view this, they will devalue their findings. And that's something that I do find quite problematic, especially within the sex educators or sexual scientists community, that they claim to not see race, but they see the race of their participants who are brown and black. So.
That's really interesting. So, I mean, it touches on something that's come up a lot throughout the series, you know, the idea of whiteness as kind of universal, as normal, as invisible in many ways to those who are also racialized as white. And so when I say normal and universal, I mean, that's how it's perceived by people racialized as white, not that it actually is. So in terms of there's so much to unpick from what you've just said. I'm really curious to hear from you about, you know, were the tables turned on figures that you're talking about, you know, the key thinkers and scientists of the world of sexology, who, from what you're saying, tend to be the ones that are recognized tend to be white, male and white. Were we to turn the tables on them today and analyze how their racial biases might be coming into their analysis, what would be your verdict there? How is their racial bias impacting on their understanding of sex and sexuality?
I think it's quite clear, and I like the phrase of turning the tables, and that's something which I do try to encourage when I'm speaking to people, that when you're looking at even certain studies, you should look at obviously how it was compiled, who compiled it, and the participants. So with majority of, like I said, the major human sexuality studies that's been published in the last like 40 to 50 years, the vast majority of the respondents are white. Now, that's not to say that because the studies aren't diverse, that they're invalid. But we have to understand that when we're even looking at studying certain things, like understanding certain sexual practices, and why is it that certain people, even if we're looking at pornography and the type of porn that certain people look at, that is, you have to understand that that's based on their understandings and their preferences, or their sexual preferences. So if we were to say, for example, with pornography, that it was recently published that anime porn is the most commonly viewed type of pornography, and that was a study looking at the viewing practices of white people in America, and then you extrapolate that and say that most men watch anime porn, you're doing a disservice to majority of non-white men, because that might not be the preference, if that makes sense. Now, not to say that, again, that study was inaccurate, but it's the way it's reported. Because it doesn't consider that that's looking at, or if you were, for example, if you were to look at some of the founders of sexology, Alfred Kinsey, who is kind of seen as like from the United States, he was like the equivalent of Havelock Ellis from the UK, who's considered to be the father of sexology here. The latter was a eugenist. He believed in the inferiority of brown and black people. Alfred Kinsey, on the other hand, a lot of his studies, he conducted these studies about human sexuality, especially male sexuality, with men in prison. So again, not only understanding that they're also predominantly white and they're in prison, but their environment. So if you're looking at the sexual practices and trying to understand sexuality and sexual orientation and things like that with people that are in prison, and then they might be engaged in, for example, same-sex relationships more than someone, for example, who's not in prison, it's not surprising that if you did that study in with men in prison, and then you found out that maybe like 10% of people engaged in same-sex relationships, for example, but then saying that's the case for men in general, is that fair, or is that correct? It's just about not just checking the whiteness, but checking how they're compiling and how they're interpreting this data. That's what I try to challenge, ask people to challenge, because, like I said, majority of the founders of sexology, and I don't really like to use the term sexology a lot. I prefer to use the term erotology, and the reason why, and I differentiate between the two, is because sexology, as we know it to be, started in the 19th century in Western Europe, and the founding fathers, whether it's Alfred Kinsey, whether it's Havelock Ellis, whether it's Magnus Hirschfeld, whether it's Ivan Bloch, they were all white middle-class men, and a majority of them, and a lot of them were racist as well. Whereas the study of sex and desire, known as erotology, that was something that was studied since time immemorial. So even with the Kama Sutra, the perfumed garden, but because when Westerners and white people in particular started looking at like the Kama Sutra, the perfumed garden that was written in like the 14th, 15th century in North Africa, and the Ovid in ancient China, because they didn't consider these sexual observations, so to speak, to be scientific, they considered it to be based on philosophical or religious teachings which they dismissed. They didn't consider it to be legitimate book about sexual studies. So for them, again, it's like they are centering themselves as that we started the studying about sex. We started discovering about the female anatomy, that like even the G-spot that's named after a German man. That's quite problematic, that a part of a woman's anatomy is named after a white middle-class German man. It's things like that again, it's like whiteness likes to center itself where the forefathers of civilization, we're the forefathers of discovering sexuality, we're the forefathers of understanding sexual pleasure. And even the Kama Sutra, which is quite funny, that there were a number of books and sexual manuals that were written in ancient India, and the Kama Sutra was one of many. But because the Kama Sutra was one of the books that was translated by Sir Richard Burton in the 19th century, and then was translated and popularized first in America and then in the UK, it became known as the world's leading sex manual because it went through white hands.
Wow.
But the other sex manuals that didn't go through white hands, they're not kind of considered.
Wow.
So it does. Sorry.
No, yeah, it's like the Christopher Columbus of the sex world.
right. And that's something that is just, again, it's like, and even when we look at controversial practices like, or considered to be controversial practices, again, I have to be careful with the words I'm using, because I think many times, like, even the language has been colonized. So when we say controversial, it's controversial where? So practice of female ejaculation, it's seen as very controversial in the West because in much of the Western world, it's considered to be urine, despite a lot of women saying it's not. Whereas in other parts of the world, it's considered to be sacred and it's considered to be a normal part of a woman's sexual experience. It's only when the West legitimizes this experience that women have, that's when it's kind of considered to be a normative practice. And again, it's that for me, that's problematic because that everything has to come through the prism of white people, particularly initially it was white men, but now even when we look at sex education, modern sex education, it's now through the prism of white women. White women are now taking over the position that white men had in terms of sex and sex education. So as much as obviously we understand that in a patriarchal society that white men were considered to be obviously the forefront and everything is about for the white male view, the white female view is also considered to be universal, and it's only their experience and understandings are considered to be the most important, and then everyone else like brown and black people need to filter through their understanding. So if it's something that doesn't go aligned with their understanding or their worldview, even certain women practices. So for example, if a white woman if a black African woman in East Central Africa undergoes some practices on her genitalia, is considered, and I'm not speaking about female genital mutilation here, I'm speaking about maybe elongation, for example, that's considered to be barbaric. Whereas if the same procedure is conducted in America with a doctor for aesthetic reasons or beautification reasons, that's considered to be cosmetic surgery and it's revolutionary. So it's just, sorry, go on.
No, so yes, so this question of the white filter legitimizing what is considered acceptable sexuality, like sort of in many ways giving us delineated boundaries that have been framed by what, like you say, white middle class men from the 19th century thought of as acceptable sexual practices. And now, as you say, kind of that sort of being taken over by presumably the new wave of feminists who are at the forefront of this conversation. I'm really interested in coming back to like the example that you gave of female ejaculation, which, as you said, is considered to be quite a controversial conversation here. Have you got a sense of why it's considered to be a controversial conversation, let's say here in the UK? Why does it make some people, the same people who might say male ejaculation without flinching, would find the term female ejaculation a bit harder to state, would they?
I think because female ejaculation, like women's sexuality in general, is poorly understood in the West. And I think a lot of men, because, and I'm speaking historically, I'm using men generally, have not understood in the Western world female sexuality and have not appreciated it, because I don't think you necessarily need to understand everything before you can appreciate it. Because they haven't understood that experience, they've dismissed it. So whereas there are many, when we look at, again, I'm speaking in the Western context, male sexuality, male sexual experiences, like you mentioned, ejaculation, it's legitimized and it's spoken about at length. Whereas even up until maybe the last 50 years, female orgasm was kind of seen, women were considered to be hysterical if they had an orgasm. And before then, women in the Western world, women's desire was dismissed. Now white people have acknowledged that women have desire. They've acknowledged with the sexual revolution in the 1960s that women are entitled to pleasure. And recently they've acknowledged that women do experience orgasm. The next stumbling block, shall we say, is female ejaculation, despite the testimonies of a number of women who say that they have experienced female ejaculation and they say that it's not the same as urine. That's still dismissed by a number of men, particularly in the UK, sexual scientists, who consider it to be urine and something which is, and even funny enough in British porn, up until recently, I think up until last year, it was female ejaculation scenes were banned.
Wow.
So again, I think it's a fear of the unknown for men. And even for some women, because not every woman will experience it, but because you don't experience it, it doesn't mean you should invalidate it because another woman has said that she experienced it.
For sure. And I mean, you've done research in this area, right? And so did you go to Rwanda? And tell me a bit about, because obviously my sense from your book is, well, you've written several books, but is that that there are societies where the approach to sexuality, the approach to, say, in this case, female ejaculation, is completely different, completely normal. It's taught from generation to generation. Can you tell us a bit about that and the different attitudes that you've encountered to it?
Sure. So my latest book, Kunyaza, The Secret to Female Pleasure, which explores the female ejaculation and squirting phenomenon in Rwanda, East Central Africa, where female ejaculation is considered to be sacred, and it's considered to be part of a woman's sexual experience, so much so that men are considered to be inferior if they're unable to make their wives ejaculate. And it's a very normative practice, and it's something that is known as a sacred water. And I was quite interested, not necessarily the technique in terms of how to make women ejaculate, but it's the culture surrounding it. Yeah. That you have a very female-orientated, pleasure-positive culture, and especially in Rwanda, which is a very small country in Africa. And then there are a number of the neighboring countries which practice female genital mutilation, whereas in Rwanda, it doesn't exist. So even looking at, and for me as well, as someone who's originally from West Africa and Nigeria, it was refreshing to hear about, again, a culture in Africa, which is, again, Africans are not a monolith. There's different, obviously, sexual practices, but you've got this practice where it's been taught for centuries by women to other women, and also men teaching other men as well that they should find the water, so to speak. They should help women experience ejaculation, or the sacred water, they call it. And it's something which, again, it's considered to be a normal practice, the same way it's normal for a woman in the Western world, so to speak, to orgasm. And it challenged the many Western attitudes about female ejaculation and squirting. And even the major study, or the so-called major study in the Western world, which says that female ejaculation is urine, this study was only conducted, the sample size was 7 women in France. And again, it shows the attitude of Westerners that, okay, you've got this study of 7 women in France who, I think 3 out of the 7, they found traces of urine in their their vaginal ejaculated fluid. So because of that, they said that, okay, female ejaculation doesn't exist, and it's urine, despite the fact, like I said, that you've got hundreds of women who've self-reported and said that the experience of ejaculation is very different to urine. It doesn't smell like urine and things like that. And there are other ancient cultures, like in the Arabian Peninsula, going back as far back as the 7th century, where they spoke about women's ability to ejaculate, and they spoke about, even Aristotle, some of the ancient Greeks spoke about, they called it female semen, but they were referring to women and ability to gush fluid. So again, for me, it's just quite interesting, because there are many ancient cultures who spoke about this practice and spoke about it like it's a normal practice and something that both women should seek, and men should obviously try and seek with their female partners. But for whatever reason, in the Western world, particularly in the UK, because we seem to be troubled by it, and I just can't understand why.
And I'm very interested in picking up on what you said about the orgasm being something that's expected, here, in a way that maybe talking about female ejaculation still taboo to some extent. But we know from studies that actually a lot of women are not orgasming, and that there's this, this orgasm gap, as it's referred to in the literature. I think the statistics I found were around only 40% of women who were ejaculating, or not even ejaculating, we would wish that for them, but who were orgasming during sex, whereas I think it was about 90+% for men. So there is an orgasm gap, and I was curious as to whether, in the research you've done, whether it's in Rwanda or elsewhere, that is there a focus on female pleasure? Is that more central in certain cultures than others? And so to what extent could we say that, is whiteness, as the structural whiteness of our society has many layers to it and many impacts? Is one of them, in your view, that it has maybe centered the male experience of sexuality?
Most definitely. I think from the Western perspective, or the whiteness perspective, sex is very phallocentric, as in it's all about the penis, it's all about penetration, and sex begins when the penis enters the vagina and ends when the man ejaculates. And that's very damaging because, as we know, that most women do not experience an orgasm via penetrative sex alone. Like some studies say, only about 30% of women frequently experience orgasm via penetrative sex alone. Whereas in many other cultures that were more female or pleasure positive or pleasure orientated, the onus wasn't on sex or orgasm, it was about female pleasure, which is more expansive. And so, for example, like with the Kunyaza practice, which I spoke a little bit about earlier, it's the practice has to do with a man using his penis to stimulate the clitoris and the labia minora, but paying particular attention to the clitoris. And we know that, again, with recent studies have shown that most women require clitoral stimulation in order to orgasm. So, and it's a non-penetrative practice. I mean, you can do Kunyaza involving penetrative sex, but it's generally a non-penetrative practice where the man uses, like I said, his penis to stimulate the clitoris. So you've got this ancient practice in Africa where it's focused on the clitoris, which is probably the reason why a number of women in Rwanda are able to orgasm. Some reports say I think 80 to 90% of women frequently orgasm and ejaculate with the Kunyaza practice. And it's not surprising because most of their sexual activities focus around clitoral stimulation, and B, women have given, because of the culture, given themselves the permission to enjoy pleasure. And the act of sex is considered to be a mutually beneficial act, and there's onus placed on the man culturally to satisfy the woman. Whereas in the Western world, there's a lot of onus placed on women to satisfy men, and sex, like I said earlier, begins with when the man enters the vagina and ends when the man ejaculates. Whereas if we understood sex or sexual pleasure, and the focus was ensuring that both parties are satisfied, irrespective of whether it's by way of penetration, whether it's by clitoral stimulation, whatever enhances pleasure, I think that's the most important thing. But I think, and another thing which is quite troubling is that because we are, generally speaking, in the Western world, or the whiteness framework is we like to quantify things. So we like to quantify how many times did someone have sex.
The scientific method,
the scientific, and that's damaging because even with the orgasm gap, is a woman can have a pleasurable experience without having an orgasm. There's a lot of pressure, unfortunately, now placed on women to orgasm. Now there's even like the same way there's pressure placed on women to ejaculate, and it's not necessarily you need to ejaculate or you need to orgasm. Rather, you should enjoy pleasurable sex, however that manifests itself. And that's something that was spoken about frequently in other ancient cultures, whereas in the Western culture, again, because it's all about how we can measure how good you are in the bedroom, how great you are in the bedroom, the only way we can measure it is by how many times you have sex, how long you last in the bedroom, how many orgasms you have, and why we need to have women to orgasm, not because it might be the most enjoyable experience for them, but it's so they can compete with men. And I think,
interesting.
And that's the whole, like, the orgasm gap is like, if a woman has as much orgasms as a man, therefore she's a man's sexual equal in the bedroom, when that's not necessarily the case. Because in like, for example, in there's a saying in medieval Arab times where they said that sexual pleasure was created by God and it was divided into 99 parts, not into 100 parts. 99 of those parts was given to women and 1 part was given to man. And that's something that is in a lot of traditional books by Muslim scholars, and that was also attributed to ancient Greeks as well as ancient Indian sex manuals. So this idea that sexual pleasure is the most important thing, that's something that I think we've lost in the Western world, because we're focusing a lot on like orgasms and trying to quantify sexual experiences rather than focusing on pleasure, which is more holistic.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's something that also comes up a lot in other episodes of the podcast, where people talk about, obviously when we talk about whiteness, we're talking about a limiting framework, which not only overemphasizes perhaps the importance of certain figures, but also limits our ability to understand the world in a much more holistic, rounded way, because we're missing out on huge swathes of knowledge. And so I wanted to push you a little bit on what you've learned, researching your books. One of your earlier books is called Illuminating the Performance, African and Arab Erotology. It's described as a traditional guide for the modern male on womanizing and erotology. And it draws upon classic Afro-Arab love treaties dating back to the 9th century. I think a lot of people in the UK would probably find it surprising that you would find sources on how to be a better lover in 9th century treaties, particularly ones that might be written by Muslims. So tell me, and I say this as a Muslim myself, and I know you're also Muslim. So what do you think people generally have misunderstood? Because I know that if you read people like Joseph Massad, who's an academic in America, he's written a lot about sort of how liberalism has constructed itself in opposition to Islam. So if the Western world thinks of itself as liberal and erotic and free, then the Muslim world is all the opposites of that. To what extent have we been missing sources of wisdom which could allow everyone to have a better sexual experience if we dipped into them?
I think a lot of people would be surprised, as I was when I first came across the rich Islamic tradition of sexually explicit material written by predominantly men, but nevertheless there was a lot of, like in the early Islamic world, erotic Arabic literature and sex manuals were very popular. It was a very popular literary genre. And again, a lot of these works, which probably will surprise many modern day readers, is that they emphasize the sexual needs of women and also the importance of female romantic fulfillment. And it was considered to be part of the characteristics, of the Prophet Muhammad, to not to be a womanizer and philanderer, but with your wives to make sure you cater and look after not only their emotional and physical needs and looking after their welfare, but also in the bedroom. And they played great emphasis. It was seen as considered to be a religious duty for a man to ensure that his wife is sexually satisfied. So there was a lot of men inspired by Islamic tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, that they were seen as, in order to be a better husband, I need to master the art of seduction and lovemaking. So a number of books written by, like I said, Muslim religious scholars, thinkers, poets in the medieval Arab world, particularly between the 9th and 14th, 15th century, where there were a number of manuals about the art of what it means to be a man, and even like womanizing as well, what it means to be a womanizer. It's got different meanings and even in the Western world. So for me, growing up, especially originally from Nigeria, to be a womanizer doesn't always carry a negative connotation, as in it doesn't mean someone who's a philanderer and someone who misguides or deceives women, takes advantage of women. It's a man who, it could be by way of marriage, who has multiple wives, or it could be a man who's prominent in the art of seduction and art of lovemaking. So even at the time when I wrote it, because it was about a few years ago when I wrote it, there was a lot of reservations on my side that whether I should use the title include womanizing in the synopsis and speak about womanizing. But then because the target audience was men, it was a way to capture their attention, because it was written, again, drawing on the sources from as far back as the 9th century, from the ancient Arab and African traditions. And a lot of those traditions are oral traditions about the art of manliness and how to, and it also speaks about sexual ethics and consent, but it says it in a way that's quite direct and targeting a male audience. So because the way you speak about sex, or the way I would speak about sex, or even when I'm conducting workshops primarily to men, it'll be very different if I'm conducting those workshops primarily to women, just because,
for sure,
from my experience, the way men they're likely to resonate with certain things that I say if I speak in a more maybe direct, you could say frank manner. Some people might even say it's crude, maybe using a bit of humor. And one thing I did love about a lot of the early Arab erotology texts was not only was it entertaining, but it was edifying as well. So they use education and entertainment. So they have humorous anecdotes which are funny but there was morals behind it. It wasn't just dry speaking about the legality of don't do this, don't do that, or do this. It was about using examples, and they featured strong women characters who had their own sexual agency and challenged their male partners as well in terms of how to satisfy them and what they like in the bedroom. And I thought it was very fascinating because, again, it was something that many people wouldn't expect, especially our idea of Muslims or Islam being a prudish religion that is anti-sex or non-sensual, when, funny enough, prior to much of the Muslim world being colonized, a lot of the Westerners looked at Muslims as being hedonistic people that just indulged in sensuality, because a lot of the Europeans at that time were considered to be extremely prudish. So it's funny how the tables have turned, whereas now a lot of Europeans and Westerners and white people are trying to understand sensuality and pursue it in different forms. And a lot of the Muslims, you could say, have regressed somewhat from their sexual heritage.
Yeah, no, that's actually very interesting, and I'm curious to hear whether in those treaties you found that, I mean, you touched on it slightly, that there were some women who were kind of pushing back and challenging their partners. But if we look at sort of the West, the so-called West, we're here speaking in the UK, I feel like, we're very much as women caught between the Madonna and the whore complex, right? So you're either, pure as white, and, we see it in surveys on how much sex people have. Women constantly underestimate and men constantly overestimate, to the point where, statistically men are meant to have had twice as many sexual partners as women, except this is a heterosexual survey. So who are they having sex with? Because there's some number discrepancies that just don't tally up. So we're sort of caught in many ways between, on one hand, this sort of pure ideal, which, although there's been a lot of challenge and pushback to that by the feminist movement, I think is still quite strong. And then on the other hand, there's a sort of, hypersex, pornified, increasingly normalized via social media presentation of femininity. But to me, they all feel quite passive. And they all feel determined by the male gaze. Was there anything in your research that takes us beyond the sort of limiting framework of women's sexuality as we conceive of it through the lens of whiteness, which might allow us to think differently about female sexuality?
Yes, there is a book written in the 10th century called Jawam al-Ladha, which is translated as the encyclopedia of pleasure, and you could say it's like the first Arabic erotic compendia, where the author, the compiler, he was based in, I think, Baghdad, and he spent a lot of time speaking about or writing about female sexual agency, the diversity of women's sexual experiences, and women owning their sexuality. And there's been a number of modern day scholars, such as Pernell and Mine, who wrote a really fascinating book on female sexuality, looking at that particular book. Now, what was quite interesting is that a lot of the women characters that the compiler, because the compiler, it's debated who actually was the name of the compiler of the book, so I'll just refer to the book as Encyclopedia of Pleasure. But the women that were related in that book, it wasn't seen. So like in the Western world, we've got, like you said, this Madonna, whore, either women are one or the other. That wasn't necessarily the case in much of some parts of the Muslim world, because to have numerous sexual experiences, it didn't make a woman less chaste, so to speak, or to be less virtuous. Mm-hmm. Because in that part of the world, or in that society in particular, for a woman to be competent in the bedroom and to embrace her sensuality was part of being a virtuous woman. But again, there was, you could say, there was shackles placed on women in the sense of, okay, are you having sex within the confines of marriage or outside of marriage? And he did relate mm-hmm. women who were sexually active both in marriage and outside marriage. But I think one of the things, especially when we're looking at historical texts, is that we don't apply modern notions of morality and chastity to historical, previous periods. And that's why it's quite difficult, because there were women, even like there are women in parts of Africa even today, who do not subscribe to this either like Madonna or like or like a virgin woman, so to speak. As in, I'm stuck between one of the two. Because, but then someone might ask the question. It's easy for you to say that as a man, and that's true. That even as a man, I have to question myself and be aware of my own blind spots. And is it that women who are engaging in multiple sexual partners, are they liberated? Is it who's to define what it means to be sexually liberated, or are they doing it under the guise under male gaze? So that's something which is quite difficult for me to answer. But one thing I did find, especially with the Encyclopedia of Pleasure book, was that he showed a variety of women's sexual experiences and female agency, that it wasn't just the one or two types, that you're either this married woman that's chaste and you've got limited sexual partners, or you're a woman who is, quote, what we would understand today to be like a sexually liberated woman who's having sexual partners with multiple. And I think we do women a disservice as well when we say that they're one of the two. Or when I read that book, so to speak. So for me, it showed a plurality of women's sexual experiences, and I think that's something which, again, is quite refreshing, because this idea that even having all of these sexual partners, or even having sex, or even embracing your sensuality, who are you doing it for? Are you doing it for society? With obviously that's based on society's understanding of what is normative or acceptable practices, or are you doing it for religious reasons or spiritual reasons, or are you doing it for yourself? So again, it does raise the question that you can challenge many people today that are engaging in, or even men as well, that are considered to be sexually liberated. Are you sexually liberated because that's what you want to do, or you feel that is what's expected of you as a free woman?
Yeah, well, that's an ongoing. We sadly won't be resolving that one for you guys tonight, but it's one to come back to for sure. On that note, I was just wondering if you're someone who's obviously studied sex and sexuality beyond whiteness, beyond the white gaze, and what would you say are some of the main things that people would be missing from a restricted, limited whiteness understanding of these areas? What is it that you know now that you feel would be so vital to the conversations we have in our current culture, where there are just so many debates, from porn to hookup culture to marriage and monogamy? What are some of the gems you can give us that show us that whiteness has not served us particularly well in this field?
I would say, rather than speaking about sex and concentrating on the act of sex, to reframe the conversation to speak more about sexual pleasure. Because when we speak about sexual pleasure, as opposed to sex, we can think about different experiences and acts which result in a pleasurable or joyful sexual experience. And there isn't as much pressure placed on penetrative sex, like I said, which is very difficult for women to achieve. And then also, when we focus and speak about sexual pleasure as opposed to orgasm, then there isn't, again, pressure placed on both men and women, because men do suffer from performance anxiety, as well as women suffer from body image issues and things like that, and trying to orgasm. There isn't much pressure placed on individuals trying to achieve X amount of orgasm. Whereas when you focus on sexual pleasure and sensuality, and sacred sensuality as well, because I think from maybe this is from my own religious perspective, and even studying other cultures, is that sex was seen to be something that is sacred, and something that you do, obviously, that when you're comfortable, but not with just anyone. And I think that's something that has been lost in today's modern culture, where sex is kind of seen as just purely for self-gratification purposes, when a lot of, I think, the ancient cultures, they were speaking not only about the physical enjoyments of sex, but also the spiritual enjoyments of sex. And that's not something that you'd want to kind of share with just anyone, kind of thing. So I think sacred sensuality and sexual pleasure, they're the two key takeaways that I took from other cultures, which I think is lacking in the Western world, which is predominantly just focusing on sex and like orgasm, so to speak.
Well, okay, so linked to that, I was wondering, is sexual pleasure in a traditional perspective always sacred, or is casual sex also ever regarded as desirable? And I suppose, connected to that, if I may, throw in the question, because we live in a culture defined by hookup culture, that's kind of like the normalized version of sexuality is hookup culture, at least for younger people. Was that ever present in more traditional cultures, and can we even make generalizations with it? Probably very different views on it in different places.
I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, when we speak about casual sex, I'm assuming you're referring to sex which is not. I'm assuming you're referring to someone who has sex with someone that they are not committed to. I'll just put it like that rather than within
You're
marriage.
right.
Because
it should probably be important to, because obviously as Muslims, for those of you who are listening who aren't Muslim, for Muslims anything that isn't marriage is basically casual sex. But yes, no, we should define it. So let's take your definition there, which would be sex between two people who have not made any kind of commitment to one another, which I think is quite common. Well, I would argue is probably the most common form of hookup today, but I haven't got statistics to back that one up. You might tell me otherwise.
Unfortunately, I don't have any statistics for casual sex, but that is something that, especially in the Arab Muslim world, a number of the early erotologists spoke about, and they served as like the sexual commentators. So although many of the writers were Muslim and religious figures, and they didn't necessarily approve of casual sex, so to speak, but they did speak about it's prevalent in parts of the societies in which they resided in. But they did speak about some of the dangers, not only from a religious or spiritual perspective, but even a physical perspective in terms of having sex with people, whether it's contracting diseases or even losing the desire to enjoy sex with someone that you're committed to if you're always sharing your body with different people. And then there are other traditions, particularly in ancient India and parts of ancient China, where they speak about if someone has casual sex with different partners, then again, from their religious tradition, there's spiritual disadvantages to that person. So a lot of the ancient cultures, when they spoke about casual sex in particular, it generally wasn't something that they were approving. It was kind of seen as something that is not an acceptable practice, and a lot of the reason that they gave was from a religious or spiritual perspective, because a lot of those cultures, sex was linked to their religious or spiritual beliefs.
So if any of them, so I'm just wondering if those authors, and we probably would have to get a bit specific, maybe if we say if some of the older ladies that you'd spoken to who have been key to teaching the practice, for example, of female pleasure, female ejaculation in Rwanda, for example, saw how we discuss sex here in the West and sexual pleasure here in the West, or in the UK in particular, what do you think would be the main issues that they would be surprised or even shocked to discover?
That's actually a very good question. I'm glad that you brought that up. I don't think they'll be too best pleased, and that was something that one of the reservations that I came across from a few people that I interviewed when I was doing my research about Kunyaza, from African women in particular, that they considered this practice to be a secret, a cultural secret, and they didn't want it to be. They didn't want it to be abused. And the way Kunyaza is taught is traditionally taught prior to marriage to prepare women and men before they get married, and it's also generally practiced within between married couples. So it's not considered to be a practice which non-married people or people that engage in casual sex practice. That's not to say that people that aren't married don't practice Kunyaza or anything like that, because they do. But
that's just cultural appropriation.
Yes. But the role, and that's why when we're speaking about some of these ancient practices, or like Kunyaza, like the African women that you was referring to, they weren't only teaching the act of Kunyaza or sex. They were speaking about sexual ethics. They were speaking about, and I think that's something that is lost in the Western world, is that, again, because the act of sex itself, anyone can do it, and many people have done it. But if we're speaking about sexual pleasure or sexual happiness, and I'll expand that as well, that to be happy, you can have sex, but to have really enjoyable, pleasurable sex, or to be sexually happy, that has to be aligned with your values and your belief systems. So if, for example, you are having casual sex and you're having a relationship with someone that you're not committed to, even if you maybe orgasm, and this is for a man or woman, because you're not in a you're not maybe emotionally connected to that person, or you don't feel you trust that person, you're not going to enjoy it as much as if you was in a committed relationship, whether it's by way of marriage or what have you. So that was something that they would speak about when they're speaking about sex that is sacred, like your body is sacred, be careful with who you share it with, and things like that. And one of the and I'm probably part of the problem to some respects. One of the problems when you're sharing this knowledge without speaking about the ethics as well is that people would just take like the practices and forget about everything else that comes with it. So Kunyaza as well, for example, it's not just about ejaculation. It's amazing. Before they speak about ejaculation, Kunyaza, the technique, the sexual practice, they'll speak a lot about making sure that your wife feels desired and making sure you as a woman feel relaxed, making sure you feel comfortable. All of the things which are as important, if not more important, than the physical act itself. Emotional or mental foreplay, however you want to call it, is more important, and it's something which, because a lot of women maybe from that culture feel entitled and feel that they deserve pleasure when they actually engage in that act of kunyaza with their husbands, it's easier for them to orgasm and squirt because they feel entitled to pleasure and they are with someone that they trust and love. So it's not, they haven't got a lot of the mental hang-ups that unfortunately which prevent a lot of women, particularly in the West, from having an orgasm. It's not that there's anything wrong with them. It's maybe because they've got a lot of things in their mind, or they're thinking about what he thinks of me, or how I look, and all of these external pressures that's preventing them. Or even with squirting, because they're thinking, oh, if I urinate, because it feels like urine and I don't want him to shame me or whatever, so I'm holding back. And that's what prevents a lot of women from really enjoying themselves in the bedroom. Whereas women in other parts of the world, because they haven't got as many mental pressures and they don't have these sexual anxieties that unfortunately is quite prevalent in the Western world, that's why probably they have maybe more pleasurable sex, because they're not overthinking things. So when we're speaking about sex, I think it's important that we speak about sex holistically and sexual ethics, rather than just speaking about like just techniques, which again I think or sex positions, which again was something that when Richard Burton translated the Kama Sutra, many people forget that only 25 or don't realize that only 25% of the Kama Sutra speaks about sex positions. It's a book about love, about romance. It's a love guide. But when we think about it now, the way it's been translated, we've just taken the juicy bit, so to speak, which are the sex positions. And that was because the Victorians at that time, that was something that was very new to them, and they kind of threw away, or they didn't consider the other parts, the majority of the book, which is speaking about sensuality and even sacred sensuality as well, because it's actually a religious book. So the Kama Sutra, and I always bring up the Kama Sutra because it's a book that everyone thinks they know of or they've heard about.
Of course, yeah. You don't quite understand it. I mean, that's a really interesting point, I think, first to maybe come to a close on, which is the idea that the sacred in some societies where that's still like the dominant framework through which people filter the world provides a unity of experience, right? You can't disassociate sex from emotions, from your spiritual relationships, from your feelings. Like they're all interconnected under this umbrella of the sacred, and a sort of level of accountability, I guess, for behavior that's linked. You can't completely disassociate one from the other, and we've done a lot of that. And in fact, there's some great studies looking at how Western categorizations have created disassociations in different areas, or between even different peoples, different tribes, different cultures, simply by thinking of them as separate when they're actually intimately linked. So lots of food for thought there. Habeeb, I want to thank you so much for your time. I think maybe now is a good time to flag some of your books. Obviously, I know Kunyaza, The Secret to Female Pleasure, The Taste of Honey is your most recent one. Any others that you'd like to flag to our listeners who might be interested in learning a bit more?
I would just think, to be honest, just Kunyaza and A Taste of Honey, because again, they're the sexually themed books, and they're the ones that most people seem to be interested in. But I speak about like history, I think that might bore people. So
okay, well they can always look. Is there a website we can direct people to?
Oh yes, rabah.com, so RABAAH.com. So all my 6 books are there, and some videos as well.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you again for that, Habeeb. Thank you all for listening to this episode of We Need to Talk About Whiteness. Please subscribe on YouTunes Please subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or SoundCloud, and join us next time for more conversations on whiteness. Peace and love, everyone. Thank you.